Hello and welcome back. So this will be another fantasy file video, and today we're going to look at Matt Barzal, and there's a very specific reason for this. In a previous video, I believe it was my first mock draft, I mentioned that I usually stay away from Barzal as there isn't much offense on Long Island, and he usually gets overdrafted in the 6th to 8th round range. But yesterday, I did a mock draft and I got Barzal with my absolute last pick in the 16th round. This just did not seem right to me. I knew he was usually overdrafted before, but that seemed like a ridiculous underdraft, so I decided to dig into his file and see what there was. So let's look at his fantasy file over the last 5 seasons, and what you notice right off the bat is that he shoots the puck. This is that lavender line right here, shots per game. He averages 2.28 shots per game over his career, and he's never dipped below 2 shots per game. The next thing that you notice is that he's consistent in his point production. So he's usually in that 0.75 to 0.9 point per game channel. This is that green line right here. So he's pretty consistent all the way through except for that rookie year. We'll come back to that in a second. But if you draft Barzal, you're doing so mostly for shots, maybe for power play points depending on the year, and overall point production. You're not going to get a lot of goals. He's not going to get a lot of hits or blocks. He's usually a plus player for plus minus, but last year he was a minus 15, so there was a bit of regression there. His best year was his rookie season, where he recorded 85 points in 82 games for 1.03 points per game. In that season, his power play points per game number was 0.33, which was good for 27 power play points on the season, and that was the highest of his career. Now, if you remember all the way back to 17-18, that was the last year on Long Island for John Tavares, and Barzal was sheltered a little bit as the number 2 center behind Tavares. So that gave him a couple of more favorable matchups, and he put up all of those numbers in only 17 plus minutes of ice time. And then obviously after Tavares left, Barzal's ice time went up, but he's expected to perform at that same level, but without that same shelter or support. And that could be why he hasn't been hitting a point per game mark since. But there is one big difference between Barzal's rookie season and every other year that he's played in the NHL, and that would be the coach. So in Barzal's rookie season, he was coached by Doug Weight, who was an offensive center during his playing career. He put up over 1,000 points in his 19 seasons, and so he kind of understood the offensive mindset and that you kind of need to let offensive players do their thing. And during that season, Barzal put up career highs in goals, assists, points, shooting percentage, and takeaway giveaway ratio. So that's takeaways divided by giveaways, and he was at a 0.74, the highest of his career. Now I'll come back to that in a second. Under Barry Trotz, it's undeniable that Barzal rounded out his defensive game, though that wasn't without growing pains, including sporadic benchings and reductions in ice time. But what is also undeniable is that his offensive production never approached that point per game level, and only one of those two trends is fantasy relevant for us. So I just highlighted the turnover and giveaways and the shooting percentage because normally you would assume more turnovers equals more risk taking with the puck, and higher risk equals higher reward, offensively speaking. But I believe the opposite is the case here, because under Doug Weight, it seems to me that Barzal held onto the puck longer and made more plays on his own, and therefore his shooting percentage was higher and the highest of his career, and his takeaway giveaway ratio was its best. Under Barry Trotz, it seemed like the two never saw eye to eye, and Barzal took different types of risks with the puck that resulted in more turnovers and lower shooting percentage, and therefore fewer goals and worse offensive production. So basically, I believe that Barry Trotz made Matt Barzal into a better two-way centerman at the expense of his offensive production, whereas Doug Weight kind of let Barzal do his thing offensively, and he wasn't overcoached into a specific type of scheme or a specific strategy, and that may have affected his production. But you also have to mention the matchup game here, because John Tavares, when he left, that left Barzal exposed to some harder matchups in terms of D pairs and opposing centers, and he did take more of the defensive responsibilities, which may have something to do with these numbers. But now, Barry Trotz is gone, and Lane Lambert isn't Doug Weight, but he's also not Barry Trotz, and he probably knows better than any of us why Barry Trotz is gone. And my hunch is that it had to do with their offensive struggles. So if you look last year, they were 23rd in the league in goals for. They averaged under 3 goals per game every year under Barry Trotz. And then, as I mentioned, Matt Barzal turned the puck over more under this Barry Trotz's system. And if you look at his ice time, he was averaging a little bit more than 17 minutes a game under Doug Weight. The next year, he was in that same range, the 17-minute range under Barry Trotz. Trotz wasn't trying to push him too much into that role. The next year, he gets bumped over to 20-plus minutes a game. And then after that 20-minute per game season, he gets bumped back down into the 18-minute range. So he was limiting Barzal's ice time and maybe protecting him, sheltering him a little bit, or just realizing that Barzal wasn't doing what you need to do to be out there for 20 minutes a game under Barry Trotz's system. But as I said, Barry Trotz is now gone, so he's going to potentially be unleashed. Now, to what extent, that's up for debate, but as we look at why this matters, this matters because Matt Barzal is being drafted at 153 ADP right now in the 13th round, almost the 14th round, and he's only been drafted in 34% of drafts. So some of these guys on this list, so the top two guys were drafted before Matt Barzal, and I don't think that's right, and I'll explain that in a second. But the guys here at the bottom, they have a higher draft percentage, meaning even though the draft went deeper and they got picked later than Barzal, they were drafted in more drafts than Matt Barzal was. So as we look at some of these guys, Ryan O'Reilly, 0.74 points per game. His 5-year average is right in that same range. 0.21 power play points per game, so pretty similar to Barzal. Same goal kind of figures, under 30 goal pace, 2.14 shots per game. So very similar to Matt Barzal, but he's, being drafted ahead of Barzal. You could maybe, warrant that if you're talking about exposure to St. Louis and some of their offensive figures. But if I'm picking St. Louis offensive players, Ryan O'Reilly is pretty far down on that list. There's probably 4 or 5 guys ahead of him just on his own team, whereas Barzal is the guy in New York that's probably going to be looked at to do a lot of the scoring, albeit Anders Lee and Brock Nelson had good seasons last year. If you look at Tage Thompson, 0.87 points per game last year. So that's right about where Barzal is every year, but he only did it one season, and he was his 5-year average, though there's not a lot of complete seasons, and a lot of that's young seasons where he hadn't established himself as a player, but he was well above his 5-year average of a 0.46 point per game. So you're not necessarily looking at that 5-year average with all that much weight, because this was his first year with a lot of opportunity where he was staying healthy for most of the season. But he was, if you're picking Tage Thompson, you're picking him for goal production and shot production. He had 38 goals last year and 3.24 shots per game. So that is higher than Barzal, but he hasn't shown this in more than one season. And if you're in a league with plus minus, he was a minus 17. So if you're in a league with plus minus, and you could maybe, account for the drop in shots per game and goals per game, you can get a higher point producer, a higher power play producer, and a guy who still shoots the puck pretty well. And you can get him a little bit later than Tage Thompson. And he's shown that he's in this range every single year, as I mentioned in that second slide. If you look at Eric Haula, he's been drafted 36% of the time, albeit in the 17th round. But last year, 0.56 points per game, a 0.16 point per game overproduction over his 5-year average. He only averages 1.8 shots per game. He does absolutely nothing on the power play, 4 power play points last year, and that's a theme with Anton Lundell as well. So 0.67 points per game, 58% drafted, so way more drafted than Matt Barzal, and he's a third-line center, obviously on a much better team, offensively speaking, but 6.7 points per game, 1.92 shots per game, and no power play production either. And then if you look at Andrew Kopp, he's a big regression candidate for me. 60% drafted, so way more drafted than Matt Barzal, and I don't think that's warranted. 171 ADP, 15th round, 0.73 point per game last year. But that was a 0.32 overproduction, so his 5-year average is 0.41. So that's about 40 points, or maybe less than 40 points a season for Andrew Kopp. Now, he, like I mentioned in the overproduction video, Andrew Kopp benefited from Patrick Laine leaving. He got a top 6 role in Winnipeg, so that bumped his production. Then on top of that, he gets traded to New York, and he plays in the garden seat role with one of the best playmakers in the league, and that helped his production. So he's due for a little bit of regression. He shoots at 2.5 shots per game, so it's the same kind of range that you're looking at for Barzal. But the power play production isn't going to be there this year. 0.14 power play points per game. And I would look at Barzal. He's put up that 0.33 season in his rookie year when he had Doug Wade as a coach. So if he gets that power play time again with Lane Lambert, you could potentially see an even better season power play point wise for Matt Barzal. So just to summarize all of this, so what am I saying in this video? Barzal is a consistent 0.85 point per game producer, 70-point pace over 82 games. He's been above 1 point per game in his past, in his rookie year no less, and that happens to be the only year that he played for somebody other than Barry Trotz. And he, unlike a few of those guys on that previous list, he is a first-line center, and he will be on the first power play unit. In the past, he's hit 0.3 power play points per game and 27 power play points total. So in order for him to have a breakout season, he will need to get back to that this year. So you're looking for the bump in power play production to make this a really good file. But there is room for improvement there, and he has done it before. In addition to that, he did underperform in specific areas last season. So he had a 9.3 shooting percentage, the lowest of his career, finished with 15 goals, and he was a minus 15, and he was a little bit underperforming on the power play at a 0.21, but that's still really decent for an underperformance year. As I mentioned in the contract year video, guys who are playing for money are more motivated to perform during the regular season. And if the Isles had just come off their conference final run, maybe Barzal would be thinking more about the playoffs. Maybe he'd be thinking less about the money, but they missed the playoffs last year, and now he is playing for money. So there should be added motivation. And on top of that, a rumor report from Nick Kyprios suggested that there was a rift between Matt Barzal and Barry Trotz, and that Lou Lamoriello chose to side with his star player over his coach. Now, if this is true, Barzal seems like the type of person to truly appreciate the gravity of what that means, and he'll likely want to reward Lou Lamoriello for his loyalty. I could be reading a little bit too much into that, but I still thought it was relatively relevant for this discussion. The main reason I made this video is because his value was dropping the way that it did. So Barzal used to be a 6th to 8th round pick, and now for no reason really, a little bit of a regression last year, but he's slid all the way towards the back of your standard 12-team draft. If you're in a deeper league, this is definite value because you may structure your draft around pushing centers late, and if you do that, you can get this guy who's going to get you about 70 points or more, maybe 25 of those on the power play, and he's going to shoot the puck 2 times a game, and you can get him in the 13th or 14th round. So there's a lot in this file. I mentioned it before. I usually don't go there, but if there ever was a reason to try to pick Matt Barzal, this is where you would do it. And like I've said on this channel before, it's not who you draft, it's where you draft them. So would I draft Matt Barzal in the 6th to 8th round? No, wouldn't touch him there. Haven't touched him there for years. But would I touch him in the 13th, 14th round as a center when he's putting up these numbers? He's first-line center, first-line power play. He underperformed last year. He's in an RFA contract year, and you're still getting him that late? Yes, that's when I would take that risk. That's when I would go to this file and potentially draft this player. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is the best value play of the entire 22-23 drafting season, but I just did want to highlight this because I noticed that this was happening in a lot of drafts, and he's falling very, very fast. And there's a couple of guys that are falling that I will continue to highlight as the drafting season comes. We're about 3 weeks away from most people's fantasy draft, maybe a month at the latest. So there will be more videos like this where I can highlight some guys who are being overdrafted, underdrafted, or whatnot. But again, I want to thank you for paying attention and sticking with it until the end, and I will see you in the next one.